With AQ40 being just around the corner, many players have started to ask how much nature resistance gear will they need, but not many have asked if they even need nature resist gear to begin with. What's up nerds, Heartless here, and in today's videos I'll be talking about the nature resistance gear requirements for AQ, more specifically for the Princess Huhuran encounter. For the past couple of months, basically ever since the release of Blackwing Lairs, players have started preparing in one way or another for the release of Ankiraj, the next 40-man raid that is scheduled for Classic WoW. One of the most talked about topics in regards to AQ40 is the need of nature resistance gear, most notably for Princess Huhuran. But is nature resistance gear really needed? I mean, after all, we're playing on patch 1.12, and so far raids have been a breeze. MC and BWL have been cleared in under 30 minutes, and a decent chunk of guilds cleared those raids in under an hour. So perhaps in Classic WoW, players won't actually need NR gear and instead will be able to simply brute force their way through it, including Huhuran. Well, in order to figure this out, we'll need to use math. So let's begin. Princess Huhuran has 999,300 hit points, roughly equal to the amount our Drakes from Blackwing Lair have. When she reaches 30% or 299,790 hit points, she'll go berserk. That's when the action starts and where the supposed nature resist gear is needed for. You see, when Huhuran goes berserk, she will start casting Poison Bolt, an AoE attack that hits the closest 15 players for 2000 nature damage each every 2 seconds. 2000 damage every 2 seconds equals to 1000 DPS taken per second to each afflicted player, or 15,000 damage taken per second total to all our soakers together. And that is excluding the regular damage our tank is going to take. So in order to completely mitigate the incoming damage, your healer should pump out 15,000 heals per second, plus whatever the tank takes, a number that no guild out there currently can produce. On average, most healers out there should be able to produce about 350 heal per second, a rough number that will vary from guild to guild. Since most guilds out there run with about 10 healers, that gives us a total of 3500 HPS, mitigating about 23% of the total incoming damage. Obviously, this number is going to change depending on the amount of healers a guild runs with and their capabilities, but we are going to use this number just to be conservative. That number is important because that gives us a rough estimate to how long we can expect our soakers to live before the Poison Bolt will start hitting the rest of the raid. I'll be using this formula in order to calculate the DPS required from our raid to finish off Huhuran before our soakers die. DPS is the DPS required from our raid in order to kill Huhuran before she kills off our soakers. BHP is the berserk hit points, a fixed value of 299,790. EHP is the effective hit points of all our soakers combined. DTPS is damage taken per second by all our soakers combined. NRV is nature resistance value, or how much damage our nature resistance will mitigate. HPS is the heal per second average of all our healers combined. So, with 770 damage taken per soaker, and with an average of 5000 HP per soaker, we're now looking at a measly 6.5 seconds before they die. But because the Poison Bolt volley comes out in intervals of 2 seconds, 6.5 seconds actually translates into 8 seconds. That means that a guild will have 8 seconds to DPS down 299,790 hit points, or in other words, produce 37,474 DPS total. That number in and of itself is out of reach for guilds out there, but we can lower it without using nature resistance gear. In Greater Nature Protection Potion. Greater Nature Protection Potion, or gnpp, absorbs between 1950 and 3250 nature damage, or an average of 2600 nature damage. In other words, it soaks a full Poison Bolt attack and then some. So, taking gnpp into account, our soakers will now have 7600 effective hit points during Berserk, which increases the amount of time they can be alive to soak to 9.9 seconds or 10 seconds in our case, because again, the volleys have a 2-second interval. This in turn reduces the DPS requirement of the raid from 37,474 to 29,979, a near 20% decrease in total damage required for one potion. While 29,979 DPS is much smaller compared to our initial 37,474, it might still prove too difficult, if not impossible, for most guilds out there. But can we lower the damage requirement even more? Yes, we can. In one word, hunters. Most guilds out there have at least 3 hunters. Some have more, a few have less. But the thing with 3 hunters is that they can provide this aura to 3 groups, giving you a perfect 15-player soaker setup that all have nature resistance aura. That 60 nature resistance might seem insignificant, but simple math shows that 60 NR equals to roughly 14% damage reduction on average, which reduces Huhuran damage output from 1000 DPS to 860 DPS, or 12,900 total DPS, minus the total average HPS. We're now looking at 9400 damage taken per second by our raid. This in turn means that we now have 12 seconds to DPS her down, and that lowers our DPS requirement down to 24,983, a decrease of 17% in DPS requirement compared to a setup with no hunters. But can we reduce it even further beyond? Well, most of you might think, but Heartless, what about a second GNPP? You did not include that in your math mambo jumbo, and it's definitely usable. Well, odds are it's going to get consumed mid-fight by her Frenzy Bolt combo, so for the sake of being safe, I decided not to include a second GNPP. But there is something else we can use. In Shin of Zanza. Shin of Zanza has a 3% chance to reflect hostile spells, not quite the reliable RNG, but it also has a guaranteed spell reflect on the first hostile spell the player receives after using the potion. In other words, what players will want to do is pop this little bad boy right as Huhuran hits 30%. That will guarantee not only to mitigate one volley, but also reflecting it into Huhuran herself. A double whammy, ladies and gents. So, let's do the math, shall we? Soaking one volley will increase our soaking time by 2 seconds, giving us now a total of 14 seconds compared to before, reducing the DPS requirement down to 21,414. But let's not forget that we also get to reflect a volley, so we can subtract that damage from our DPS requirement. Of course, we'll also add an average of 16% for Huhuran to resist her own reflect, so we get an average of 25,200 damage from the reflect, lowering our DPS requirement down to 19,614. A number that is now much more feasible for a lot of guilds out there. But hold on, this whole video so far was based on a fixed number of HPS that healers can output. But what happens if a guild has less HPS or more than what was mentioned? Well, let's increase the HPS to 4,500. That will bring down the incoming damage to 10,500 damage taken per second, assuming we still have all other forms of mitigation, that is GNPP, NR Aura, and Shin of Zanza. We're now looking at 16 seconds to burn down Huhuran, or a DPS requirement of 17,162. Conversely, if we lower the HPS by a similar amount to 2,500 HPS, we're now looking at 12,500 damage taken per second, which gives us a 12-second window to DPS Huhuran down, or a 22,883 DPS requirement. So, going back to our previous DPS requirement of 19,614, it seems that we finally get a reasonable number, one that is more feasible for guilds to reach. So, does that mean we don't need NR if our guild can dish out that amount of DPS? Well, not quite. You see, there is a mechanic I have ignored so far just to ease up on the math. But now that we have reached some reasonable numbers, it is time to introduce it. Wyvern Sting. Wyvern Sting is an AoE sleep effect that affects up to 10 closest targets to Huhuran and puts them to sleep for 10 seconds. And while it's cleansable, you really shouldn't because it will deal 3000 nature damage to the target. The sleep effect can be resisted, so in our case with 60 NR, we're looking at 14% chance to resist it, or about 1 player out of the 10. Wyvern Sting also has a 15 seconds cooldown, though it's not cast on a regular interval, which means, worst case scenario, she'll cast it every 15 seconds. But sometimes it will be cast after 30 or even 40 seconds. So, let's assume worst case scenario here, and also assume a semblance of brain was used as to when to transition here. In other words, hold Huhuran at 31%, let her Wyvern Sting the raid, wait it out, and then transition her to Berserk. We already calculated earlier that we'll have 14 seconds to DPS her down, which leaves us with 1 second to spare in order to skip this mechanic. Truth is, for most guilds out there, this will be too close for comfort. So we'll just assume that this mechanic will hit the raid at least once during Berserk phase, so the math will look like this. Most guilds will have 26 DPS, of which 10 will sleep, assuming no pets were hit, also assuming Bearer of Trinket can't soak the Wyvern Sting, and that those 10 DPSers are all melee, which on average will contribute about half of your raid's total DPS. We're now looking at 10 seconds where our raid will do about 9,000 DPS total, leaving us with a total kill time of 20 seconds. Which is 6 seconds longer than what our healers can keep up with. So, what does this all mean? What is the final answer to the question, do we need nature resistance gear or not? Well, as you might have guessed, the answer is, it depends. Unfortunately, the Wyvern Sting mechanic changes everything. If you can guarantee yourself the ability to skip this mechanic by having perfect timing, high DPS and high HPS, then Huhuran becomes significantly easier. However, if your raid is unable to skip it, it will mean that nature resistance gear is going to be required. And that, most likely, is going to be the case for the vast majority of guilds out there. WoW isn't complicated. And at the end of the day, it's a game with some basic mathematics behind it. And so it all comes down to whether your guild can finish off Princess Huhuran before she finishes off your raid. And to know the answer to that, you just gotta figure out how much DPS and HPS your guild can output. To make it easier on you guys to figure out whether your guild will need NR or not, I'll leave a link to my Excel sheet in the info section down below that you can use to determine how much NR your soakers should farm so that you're ready for AQ40 by the time it's released. As always, if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like it and perhaps even subscribe. And if you didn't, well, feel free to dislike it. It's also okay. But anyway, I'll see you guys next time.